Sometimes in a lease agreement, the lessee will be responsible for something called executory costs. Let's say that you're renting out the 11th floor of a building for your company. Okay, so you're renting out the 11th floor, you're a tenant, there's a landlord, and that landlord incurs building maintenance costs, utilities like electricity, natural gas, property taxes, insurance, common area expenses. Maybe there's an exercise gym in the building and there's some expenses associated with that. And if the landlord is holding you responsible for these costs are known as executory costs. And the question is, how should the lessee account for these executory costs under IFRS 16? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on whether this is a gross lease or a net lease. Now, that's a lot of terminology I just threw at you, and actually this is not all that complicated. So let me try and break it down to make it simple. Okay, so when I say a gross lease, what I mean is the nature of the payment, okay, of these executory costs is fixed in that it's just built into the periodic rental payment. Okay, so if you're paying $15,000 a month for rent for the 11th floor of this building, and built in there is $500 or something like that, part of that rent payment is for these executory costs, then we'd say, okay, the nature of the payment is fixed, it's built into the rental payment already, this is a gross lease, and you don't need to have a separate expensing of whatever the expenses happen to be for these executory costs for a month. Let's say they're $350 for the month. You wouldn't say, oh, I better go and record an expense for that, because it's already included in your lease liability, because it's seen as, okay, these costs were like built into your periodic rental payments. So this is part of your lease liability to begin with, and it's also part of your right of use asset. Because remember, when you calculate your right of use asset, you start with the initial lease liability, but that's just a little quick review. In any event, so if these executory costs are just fixed and they're just part of the rental payment, hey, so it's just like, look, it's $350 every single month, and that is part of this rent, that $15,000 that you're paying every month, then you do not separately expense them. It's just like, look, we already accounted for it. We got this $15,000 rental payment, and we calculated the lease liability based off that, okay? Now, sometimes the lessee will have it set up with the lessor where these payments are going to be variable, which means that if the building incurs more electricity, more utilities in a given month, and it's like, oh, usually, with these expenses were $350 maybe last few months, but now they're $500 this month. Okay, so it's variable. It's not the same. It's not just, oh, well, it's just built in. It's $350 every single month. It's like, well, it was $350 last month, but now it's $500. Next month could be $550. Next month could be $475. If it's variable, and it's like the landlord is charging you based on what their actual utilities are and it's changing, then we will categorize this as what's called a net lease. And then whatever the expenses are, these executory costs, they will be expensed as incurred. For example, if we say, okay, well, last month it was $350, but this month is $500. Okay, then you would record an expense. If you were the lessee, you would record an expense because this wasn't included in the lease liability. Okay, I hope you get the distinction here. With the fixed, okay, this gross lease, what we're saying is, look, your annual rental payment was set by the lease agreement at $15,000, and $350 of that $15,000 was like basically, okay, that's compensating the lessor for executory costs. And you wouldn't expense this every month because, look, it's part of your rental payment, okay? But when it's not a fixed part of the rental payment, when it is variable, and say, okay, let's say the next month is $475, then you don't say, oh, well, this was already included in my lease liability, okay? And instead, what you would do is you would record an expense.